Well, it's a great pleasure for me to be here, not only because of your red wine, but also because of your dinosaur footprints and all of the other dinosaur resources that are found in La Rioja and that have become world famous as well. I'm not going to be talking about dinosaur footprints today, but actually I started my career working on dinosaur footprints and since have well, I still work on dinosaur footprints, but now I leave it to other people like Angelica, as well as teeth, which she works on, and is another one of my favorite topics, and I'll mention that a little bit later on. As far as where I came from, I was a kid of 6 years old and decided that I wanted to work on dinosaurs because I found a dinosaur toy inside a box of cereal. And it wasn't really a dinosaur. This is the actual one. It's a Dimetrodon. And if you know anything about paleontology, you know this is much older than dinosaurs. This is a very ancient animal. And interestingly enough, in my career, I ended up working on this animal as well. But you know, finding a toy in a box of cereal is one way to start your career. But I like this cartoon because it shows a dinosaur finding a toy person inside its box of cereal, and it makes some kind of sense too. My real influence, though, was this book. And when I was 11 years old, I read this book, and it was a book not just all about dinosaurs. It was a book about what it was like to be a dinosaur paleontologist. And as soon as I read the book, I knew that I wanted to hunt dinosaurs for the rest of my life, and that's what I started doing. Luckily enough, I managed to get to Alberta in Western Canada. In Western Canada, we have a tremendous number of dinosaurs, and that's partly because we have the development of badlands. And in the badlands, we can find bones much easier than you can find in places where the rock is covered up by soil or forests or anything else. Alberta is so rich in badlands and in dinosaurs that in 1979, Dinosaur Provincial Park in Alberta became the first UNESCO World Heritage Site devoted to paleontology. And just to give you an idea just how rich it is, I'll show you all of this fine squiggles. These are just the dinosaurs found in Dinosaur Provincial Park. And there's about 40 to 50 species we now recognize from Dinosaur Park. The main point is that it's not just dinosaur skeletons that we find there. It's also a tremendous diversity. Do you know what this goes into? Where does it go? An audio thing. But it's the wrong kind of plug.
Oops. Que no tiene el conector adecuado.
Do you think it goes into this one?
Lo sentimos. ¿Están escuchando bien la traducción? Ellos están escuchando bien la traducción. ¿Sí? ¿Y ustedes no?
No problem. Okay, so this is a very rich ecosystem, and you have many species of dinosaurs, but in addition to the dinosaurs, we also have fish, turtles, lizards, snakes, mammals, pterosaurs. These are all things that lived at the same time as the dinosaurs. So there are more than 150 species known from Dinosaur Provincial Park. And as Eva will talk in her talk, but we also know from Dinosaur Park more than 500 species of plants of a different kind that she will talk about. The history of looking for dinosaurs is an old one. The first dinosaur bones found in that area came from 1898. However, the main collector for Dinosaur Provincial Park was actually started by Barnum Brown from New York City, and he was at the American Museum of Natural History, and he came to Alberta and he collected many species of dinosaurs that are now on display in New York City. So one of the greatest places to advertise dinosaurs is the museum in New York City, where people can go and see so many, and they read the labels and they see they're from Dinosaur Park in Alberta, Canada, and then they come to Alberta, Canada to see the dinosaurs and where they came from. But this is a picture of Barnum Brown taking a load of dinosaur fossils out of Dinosaur Park. They were shipping basically on a train. You have what are called box cars. They would ship up to 4 box cars of dinosaurs every year back to New York. So that's how rich the area is. One of the dinosaurs they found, though, in 1915 was this specimen. This is an animal called Dromaeosaurus, and it's what we call a type specimen. That is, it's the name bearer. This is the first specimen found that was given this name and recognized. And in fact, it's still the only specimen we have of this particular dinosaur. These are very, very rare animals. For some reason, in Dinosaur Park, when we find dinosaurs, they tend to be big specimens. Small specimens, whether it's a baby of a big dinosaur or a small species of animal, they're very rare. And it's probably because the rivers were very powerful, and after the animals died, their skeletons would get washed a long way, and also because tyrannosaurs, things like Albertosaurus and Gorgosaurus, and of course Tyrannosaurus rex, they had big mouths and they were able to eat things in their entirety. So a small animal would just disappear, period. So small animals are always extremely rare, and that also holds true for many other parts of the world, including here. You don't find many small dinosaur skeletons. You find the teeth of those skeletons. You find footprints of big dinosaurs here, but you don't find many skeletons, or not very much evidence of small dinosaurs. And Dromaeosaurus, this is the actual fossil, and you can see maybe that you can see the jaws with the teeth. Well, this is a skull that has fallen apart, and if you put the skull back together, it looks like this. So Dromaeosaurus was actually the very first what we call raptors that were discovered. And you may be familiar if you saw the movie Jurassic Park, any of the Jurassic Park movies, that the raptors in there are Velociraptor. But before Velociraptor, the name came from Dromaeosaurus. So Dromaeosaurus is just one of the many raptors that are now known in the Northern Hemisphere. This is a reconstruction of the skeleton that we did for Dinosaur Provincial Park. The animal was, as it turns out, very, very rare. We find teeth of this animal sometimes, but they're also very rare. So we've never found another skeleton of Dromaeosaurus, and there's still only the one that's in New York City. Now, the American Museum of Natural History in New York also started working in Mongolia in the 1920s. And in 1923, they found a skull of another dinosaur that's called Velociraptor. And this dinosaur was named in 1924 And this is the type specimen from Mongolia. The animal is not as rare in Mongolia as it is in Alberta, but it showed us that we had a diversity of these small meat-eating dinosaurs. And the whole animal would be smaller than your pet dog. So they're not very big. There have been some remarkable specimens found. This is probably one of the most remarkable fossils ever discovered in the world. This is what's called the Fighting Dinosaurs. And in this particular case, we have two skeletons together. And the two skeletons are one plant-eating dinosaur and one Velociraptor. And the Velociraptor was trying to kill the Protoceratops when it also ended up dying. And I think what happened is that the hand of the Velociraptor is inside the mouth of the Protoceratops. And when it killed the Protoceratops bit its hand and held it, and it didn't release the hand. And unfortunately for the Velociraptor, this happened at the same time there was a sandstorm, such as still happens in the Gobi Desert, and both animals were buried in sand. And so the Velociraptor wasn't able to escape, and it finally suffocated and died with its prey. So the two dinosaurs are found together, and this is an amazing circumstance that happens very rarely, where you see one animal interacting with another animal at the same time that they died. So Velociraptor we know very well because we have complete skeletons with complete skulls. Now the first Velociraptor, though, was only a skull and a few other bones from the skeleton. So we didn't understand a lot of things about either Dromaeosaurus or Velociraptor, but in the United States in 1964, John Ostrom discovered another type of raptor. And that type of raptor is an animal called Deinonychus. And for Deinonychus, there was skull material and there was skeletal material. And so for the first time, we had good evidence to see what these animals looked like as whole skeletons. And this is Deinonychus, a reconstruction that was done. You can see it has a very long, stiff tail. And it's a stiff tail because you can see extensions off the vertebrae, the lower picture, and they extend beyond that one vertebra. They, in fact, go along the edge of the tail. And these are bony structures that actually intertwine, and much like a cable, where you have metal that's intertwined with other metal threads. It's movable, but not very movable. It's quite stiff overall. And so this is a special characteristic of the raptors, and it has something to do with their locomotion. Another character that's very interesting that we didn't know about before is the foot structure. And in the feet, you have three main toes that touch the ground, like a Tyrannosaurus rex. But you also have one toe that's on the back of the foot. And that toe in modern birds is the perching toe. It's what allows the animal to sit on branches and hold on to the branches. Well, the same toe is present in these dinosaurs. But the next toe to it, the one we would call the second toe, has a claw that is so big, the claw is raised off the ground. And if you ever look at a house cat foot, you'll see that house cats have very long, very curved claws, and they're normally retracted. They're pulled back from the foot so that they're not touching the ground except when they need them for either killing the prey or climbing trees. The toe on these raptors the second toe, is the only one like that, but it clearly was constantly raised above the ground. So of the 3 toes, the 3 middle toes in the foot, only 2 of them touch the ground, and the third toe is raised up. And you can see it in the drawing to the right where the toe is raised up. When we find those as fossils, it's always raised up like that. Now, John Ostrom studied the Deinonychus, and really the reason that there's so much interest in dinosaurs now is because of the discovery of this dinosaur. Then we realized that dinosaurs were perhaps a little more interesting than people once thought. And people, of course, knew about the big dinosaurs. They knew about Tyrannosaurus rex, they knew about Brontosaurus, the thunder lizard, and so on. But the small dinosaurs they didn't know anything about. And the small dinosaurs are in a way more interesting, and they're probably more common than the big dinosaurs. But as I mentioned before, they don't fossilize as easily, and so we don't find them as easily. And one thing that John Ostrom realized is that if you studied these raptors and then you compared them to the very first known bird, which is Archaeopteryx, that there are a lot of features in those 2 animals that suggest they're very closely related to each other. And so John Ostrom proposed that birds, in fact, came from meat-eating dinosaurs. This wasn't a new idea, but it was an idea that had been forgotten for a long time. And when you look at certain features in the skeleton, you can see that Archaeopteryx and Velociraptor in particular, or Deinonychus, are very, very similar to each other. They have some peculiarities that are really not found in any other animals. So if you look at the hand, and that's what we're looking at here, we can see, for example, that the bones that are labeled in Roman numerals, 1, 2, 3, those are the bones from the flat of your hand. And if we look at the smallest one, the thumb, that's number 1. So this bone in the hand is very, very short, and next to it is a much longer one, and then the next one, though, is very, very thin. And it's the same in both birds like Archaeopteryx, very primitive birds, but also even in modern birds. So when we look at a modern bird as an embryo, before the bones all fuse up, it has the same structure as we see in the raptors. So these are just a few of the features that we use to compare birds with dinosaurs. And by the 1980s, everybody realized that there were so many skeletal characters that were only found in these small raptorial dinosaurs and birds, that therefore birds must have come from these types of dinosaurs. So it was a very big change in how people thought of things. Now this is a rancher woman from Alberta, and she was somebody who, when she wasn't involved with the farm or the ranch, she liked to go out and hunt fossils. And in 1974, she found the 3rd known raptor in Alberta, and this became an animal called Saurornitholestes. And Saurornitholestes is reconstructed here from several partial skeletons from Alberta and Montana. We really had no idea what the animal looked like, but we knew it was related to Velociraptor, so we could guess what it would look like. Some people thought that Saurornitholestes was so much like Velociraptor that they must be the same dinosaur, just living in 2 different parts of the world. And Saurornitholestes unfortunately only had part of the skull, This is the top of the skull from between the eyes, and on either side facing sort of down and forward, that's the edge of the eyes. And, but that's really all we had to look at in terms of the skull. And we had, from the skeleton, we had parts of the skeleton, so we knew what the skeleton looked like. And we could see that, for example, here you can see the tail, and you can see all those long rods that run beside the tail, that stiffen the tail. So we knew Sornitholestes was very, very much like Velociraptor, and it's about the same size. We also found teeth, and the teeth are very interesting, of course, because they have serrations down the front and the back of the tooth. But when you look at the serrations, they have a very distinct shape compared to other dinosaurs. So the base of the serration is kind of straight, but towards the end, the serration is hooked towards the tip of the tooth. And that's to help it saw its way through flesh, and it's very distinctive. But the other thing you might notice on the picture on the left is that the serrations on the back of the tooth are much, much bigger than the serrations on the front of the tooth. And this is also very similar to some teeth that we find here in Spain, and also teeth that are known for Velociraptor or Deinonychus or any of the other raptors. So they're very easy to identify. Around the year 2000, this dinosaur was found in China. This is another one of the raptors, and it's known from several complete skeletons. But the difference is those complete skeletons also had preserved with them feathers. And so we know now that the raptors, in fact, were feathered dinosaurs, and those feathers were not long enough to allow them to fly, and may have been there either for attracting mates, maybe, or maybe just for body warmth. We're not really sure. But nevertheless, they're very distinctive animals. And we know that even though we don't find the feathers on Sornitholestes in Alberta, that's just because of preservation. Feathers are not something that preserve very easily or fossilize very easily. Like fingernails, like skin, like hair, they're things that rot very rapidly, and so they don't get fossilized very often. We had another surprise a little while ago, a specimen that had been found for the University of Alberta back in the 1970s was in our collections, and that specimen is from something very distinctive. We could tell it was very distinctive, but because it was so small, it was only about that long, 5 centimeters or so long, it was misidentified at first as being from a lizard. But it didn't make sense as a lizard. And eventually one of our students realized that it wasn't a lizard, it was in fact another one of the raptors, but a very small version of it. And I mentioned before Sornitholestes, not Sornitholestes, but Sornithoides, which is from China, and that it had feathers with it. It's also a very, very small chicken-sized animal. And it turned out that when we went through all of the small things we had from Alberta, in fact, that this is a little animal that is very closely related to the specimens from China, these feathered dinosaurs. And one in particular it's very close to, it's an animal called Microraptor. Microraptor is an unusual animal because not only does it have long feathers behind the arms, it also has long feathers behind the legs. And it's thought that this is probably an animal that glided from tree to tree, using those long feathers as a way to get around faster from one area to another. Well, the Alberta form is called Hesperonychus, And Hesperonychus was obviously very closely related to this Microraptor from China. Now, Sornitholestes, as I mentioned, we didn't have very much to go on. We just had one skull bone, and we were still trying to figure out exactly what the animal was related to when we started to find better material. So this is an isolated jaw of Sornitholestes, and we could identify it again by comparing it to Velociraptor. But still, we lacked a complete skull, and so we were always on the lookout to try and find something that was more complete. And in 2014, we had a canoe trip down the Red Deer River, and during that trip, this person, Lee Trelaw, she was lucky enough to find an armored dinosaur skull. And the same day, this is in Dinosaur Provincial Park, one of our head technicians went out and he found something that was very, very interesting. And these were little tiny toe bones from what looked like one of these raptors. And so we went back and we went to this area that we'd been to many, many times over the years, but never seen these bones. And we started digging. And after a week or so, we realized that we had most of the skeleton of a Sornitholestes, finally, after all these years. And so this is what the quarry looked like. I mentioned before the rancher's wife who had found the first Sornitholestes back in 1974. This is her son, actually, on the quad, who helped us take out the new specimen of the same kind of dinosaur. It's not very far from where the first specimen came out, about 300 meters away. So there's no question about the time and the environment where these dinosaurs lived. They lived in the same time and environment. This is the animal as we found it. This is a complete skeleton except for the end of the tail. We have the base of the tail, so we can compare it to other specimens, and we can see it had the long, stiff tail. But there were things on the skeleton that we had never seen before on Sornitholestes. So, for example, if you look at the ribs, and this is the ribs, and the lower bone towards the left, that's its upper arm bone. But you can also see that attached to the ribs are these other processes, which are called uncinate processes, which is something we find in birds as well. It's part of the breathing mechanism. The claw is truly amazing because the claw still has the sheath on the outside. That is, the fingernail is essentially there. So if you look at the labels there, it says where the end of the bone is, and what goes beyond that is the fingernail. And the fingernail, which is made out of keratin, is soft, and as I said with the feathers, it doesn't preserve very often. But it shows you just how long and slender this claw is. It is very much like a modern cat claw in a way. So you can see why it kept the foot off the ground. This is a CAT scan from the foot, and you can see that the claw, it preserves slightly different than the bone as well. But we can get internal detail on the bones with x-rays, CAT scans, and MRIs. It's one way that technology has helped us to understand dinosaurs a lot better without actually having to take them out of the rock. The skull is pretty amazing because the skull is complete. And when we look at the skull of this animal, we can see finally in what ways it's different from Velociraptor. Velociraptor has a skull that has a very long and low snout. And basically, Sornitholestes has a very short face that's much deeper. So it probably was using its jaws to eat prey in a very different way. So this is the reconstruction of the skull. The eye is in the middle, essentially. It's the large round structure. And in front of that, you'll see there's a large hole in the side of the face. And that hole, which is called the antorbital fenestra, or window, is very distinctive in these dinosaurs, all of the carnivorous dinosaurs, in fact. But we can look at the shapes of them, and we can determine a lot about differences between different species. What's interesting is that in Saurornitholestes, the opening, the antorbital fenestra, which is a sinus that would have had air in it coming from the roof of the mouth, those sinuses actually extend into the bones around that fenestra or opening, so that the bones in the skull are also hollow and air-filled, a lot like modern bird bones are. The teeth were a bit of a surprise to us, because when we looked at the teeth in the front of the mouth, the teeth are flat on one side, and they have these long vertical ridges or longitudinal ridges, as well as the serrations on the front and the back. And they're very different than the teeth we find in, say, tyrannosaurs or other carnivorous dinosaurs. So it turned out that a type of dinosaur described only from teeth back in 1876 is in fact the tooth from the front of the mouth of Saurornitholestes or related raptors. So we in fact had managed to look at the skull of this specimen we collected in 2014, and for the very first time realized a type of tooth found for and named of a dinosaur back in the 1870s was in fact the same kind of dinosaur. So we solved another mystery. We can cut bones and polish them and look at them under the microscope. It's called histology. It's something that people who work on modern animals have done for a long time, but it's something that's only been happening in paleontology over the last 20 years or so. And we can look at those bones, and we can see that inside the bones we have rings, and those rings essentially are annual growth rings. And there's differences in thickness of those rings, so we can learn how fast these animals were growing, how long they lived, and how the growth rates changed throughout their life. And from looking at the Saurornitholestes leg bones and looking at the histology this way, we can see that this dinosaur was about 8 years old when it died, and that it was a mature animal, that is, that it had almost stopped growing completely and really wouldn't have grown much bigger than it was. So that's very interesting. The green arrow here is pointing to something we weren't expecting to find. Basically, this is a very large bone that doesn't belong to the Saurornitholestes, and it's in the front of the chest, and it goes inside the rib cage. This bone is probably from another type of carnivorous dinosaur called an ornithomimid, and that bone is lodged inside the chest of the Saurornitholestes. This is probably what killed the Saurornitholestes. He ate something that was too big for it to swallow, and it got stuck in his throat, and he choked to death. It's a very interesting idea. You think, well, that's pretty stupid. Why would an animal do that? But of course, if you have a dog, especially when it's a puppy, you realize that sometimes they eat things that they shouldn't be eating, and they eat things that are very big. And there are many animals that do that. And a couple of years ago, we had an opportunity to look at Komodo dragons in action in Indonesia. And this is a very large Komodo dragon that's about 3 meters long. These Komodo dragons were eating a wild boar, and this one, though, when the rest of the wild boar had been eaten, decided he was going to eat the head of the wild boar. The head of the wild boar is much bigger than the skull of the Komodo dragon, and he couldn't swallow it, so he walked up to a tree and he forced the skull of the wild boar down his own throat. So many animals today, whether it's mammals, lizards, or birds, will sometimes eat things that are very large. And sometimes, like this Komodo dragon, they can get it down their throats, and in other cases, though, they actually choke on it and then they end up dying. So gluttony is a very awful thing. This is the rib cage again of that Sornitholestes. And you may notice that in amongst the rib cage, you see the sediments inside, but there's two different colors there. And one is sort of a lighter reddish-brown color. And when you looked at it, you realize that this is probably something inside the intestines of the animal. And so we were curious about it, and the hole you see there, the round circle, is where we cored that. And then we took it and did Tim's analysis on it to look at the elemental construction of basically the geochemistry inside that compared to the rest of the specimen. And we realized that it has a very high concentration of apatite in it. Apatite is what helps make up bones, one of the main structures in bone. And so unquestionably what we were looking at is the remains of the large intestine of this dinosaur as well, and not surprisingly, considering it's a carnivorous animal, a lot of the material inside the large intestine was in fact digested bone. Now the specimen got a lot of preparation in Japan, and that's because the Japanese are very interested in dinosaurs. As you may be aware, they do many big displays on dinosaurs. So we decided to send our head technician who had found the specimen to Japan to prepare the specimen in public view. Public got a great charge of this. You can see them on the right side. There's actually a glass window there that allowed them to look inside the laboratory so they could see Clive working on the specimen. And every now and then he would move because when you're working under a microscope, you're very focused. So they actually thought in most cases that he was a mannequin. He wasn't a real person. So when he moved, they would be quite shocked. And but the great thing for us is that because Clive had to stay there all that time working on the specimen, then we got the specimen prepared much faster there than we would have back in Edmonton. Raptors are fascinating dinosaurs. This is another picture of Dinosaur Provincial Park. They're very rare, as I mentioned, and so this is an exceptional specimen in so many ways. There are other raptors that we know existed in Dinosaur Provincial Park 75 million years ago. So every year we go back and we still try and find more of these fascinating dinosaurs. And I think one of the reasons I love studying dinosaurs so much is because we have so many mysteries surrounding the smaller dinosaurs in particular. And the raptors are some of the most fascinating because they're the ones that are very closely related to modern birds. And so in some ways, when we study these ancient animals, we have to look at birds. And in other ways, it's fascinating because it also works in reverse. Birds are the direct descendants of these raptorial dinosaurs, and to a modern paleontologist, or to a modern biologist as well, dinosaurs did not become extinct 65 million years ago. They're still very alive and well today. Thank you.